Dear listeners, I ask you to listen to the story until the very end and be sure to write a review about what you liked and what needs to be changed to make it more interesting for you to listen to my stories. The one in the closet. It started with a whisper. The kind of quiet murmur that drifts through the cracks of your mind when you're trying to forget something. But I couldn't ignore it. That night, as the shadows of the room stretched long and thin, it was there, lurking in the dark, the sense that something wasn't quite right. My son, Timmy, had been acting strange all evening. He'd been quiet for days, his eyes a little too wide, his words a little too slow, like he was carrying some heavy weight he couldn't shake off. At first, I thought it was just the nightmares again, the kind that all kids have. But when he said it, standing in the doorway to our room, clutching his blanket like it was his last lifeline, that's when I knew something was wrong. Mom. Dad. There's someone in the closet, he whispered, his voice trembling, barely audible over the hum of the house settling. My first instinct was to brush it off. Timmy had an active imagination. He'd been talking about monsters under the bed and shadows on the walls for weeks, and I chalked it up to just a phase. Kids that age get scared of the dark, don't they? I smiled at him, trying to make the moment feel less frightening, trying to convince myself that I wasn't scared too. But when he looked up at me with those big, pleading eyes, something in his face made my blood run cold. Timmy, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, there's nothing in the closet. You just had a bad dream. But he shook his head. No, Mom. There's someone in there. I hear them breathing. I don't want to go to sleep. His words felt like a punch to the gut. I tried to laugh it off, give him a hug, reassure him that everything would be fine. I told him the usual things, how there's nothing in the closet, that no one was hiding behind the door, that he was safe. But when I went to check the closet, there was nothing there. Just a pile of clothes hanging on hangers and the faint smell of mothballs. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. You're just imagining it, I told him, brushing his hair out of his eyes as I turned to leave. Go to bed, Timmy. Everything's okay. But Timmy wasn't convinced. He stood frozen in the doorway, watching the closet with an intensity that made my stomach churn. I told him to lie down, but he only shook his head again, this time more vigorously, as though the thought of being near the closet was unbearable. I kissed him goodnight, and we left the room with the door slightly ajar, the soft glow from the nightlight casting a faint halo over his bed. But as I stepped back into the hallway, I heard it. A soft, barely perceptible scratching sound, like nails tapping against wood. It was so faint, I almost convinced myself it was my imagination. Still, I stopped in my tracks. I glanced back at Timmy's room, the door still cracked open. The sound came again, this time louder. More deliberate. My heart began to race, and for the first time that night, I felt it too. A chill crawling up my spine. A sense of something that shouldn't be there. I stood there for a long moment, holding my breath, my hand hovering over the light switch. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, just the house settling, the wind rustling against the windows. But I couldn't ignore the look on Timmy's face. I couldn't ignore the cold knot of dread curling in my stomach. I pushed the door open again, my eyes scanning the room. The closet door was slightly ajar, as it had been when I checked earlier. I stepped inside, reaching for the light. Everything was still. The closet was empty, no one hiding behind the clothes, no strange shadow creeping along the floor. It was just a closet. But there was something in the air. A presence. Something, watching. I didn't know how to explain it. But I felt it. I told myself it was nothing. But something told me I was lying. Timmy was asleep by the time I left his room. I was about to close the door when I heard the sound again. This time, it was clear, the low, raspy breath that seemed to come from the closet, as though someone was waiting. Waiting for something. I swallowed hard. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. There was no way I was going to check again. Not tonight. Not after the fear that was clenching my chest. I backed away slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. But before I left, I made one last promise to myself. Tomorrow, I'd make sure there was nothing hiding in that closet. Tomorrow, I'd check again. But as I turned the corner and walked down the hallway, a fleeting thought crossed my mind. What if I was already too late? The night passed in a haze of unease. I tried to shake off the feeling that clung to the air like an invisible fog, but it lingered, settling in the corners of the house, creeping under the doors and through the cracks in the walls. The darkness felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the shadows themselves were watching, waiting for something to happen. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified, every whisper of wind against the window felt like a threat, and I couldn't shake the image of Timmy's terrified face, his wide eyes locked on the closet as if it held the very secrets of the universe. I told myself that it was just his imagination, children had wild fantasies, after all. But even as the words passed through my mind, they didn't sit right. Something was wrong. And I knew, deep down, that no amount of reassurance was going to make it go away. The morning came too quickly, its light doing little to dispel the feeling of dread that clung to me. Timmy seemed quieter than usual. He didn't complain about breakfast, didn't ask to play outside. He sat at the table, pushing his cereal around in circles, his gaze drifting off into the distance. I could see the remnants of fear in his eyes, the kind of fear that doesn't fade easily, that sticks with you even in the light of day. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost as if he was afraid of breaking the silence. "Mom, can we check the closet again?" I tried to smile, but it felt forced, unnatural. I wanted to tell him there was no need, that we had checked it the night before, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But instead, I found myself nodding, the words slipping from my lips before I could stop them. "All right, Timmy. We'll check the closet again." We made our way to his room, the hallway stretching before us like a long, narrow tunnel, the faint sound of Timmy's little footsteps echoing against the walls. The house felt cold again, colder than it should be for a spring morning. When we reached his room, I could feel my pulse quicken, the air thick with the same tension that had settled there the night before. I opened the door slowly, the creaking sound of the hinges somehow louder than it should have been. Timmy was right behind me, his hand clutching the hem of my shirt, his little body trembling. I stood there for a moment, taking in the room. Nothing had changed. The bed was neatly made, the toys scattered across the floor just as they had been the night before. The closet door, though, was still ajar, just a crack, but enough to make my heart race. I reached for the handle, my hand cold against the metal, my fingers shaking ever so slightly. I pulled the door open, my breath catching in my throat. Inside, the closet was empty, just as it had been before. But the air felt different. It was thick, suffocating, as if the room had been holding its breath. And I realized, in that moment, that it wasn't the closet that was the problem. It was something else, something that had been in the room all along, something I hadn't seen or acknowledged. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, my skin prickling with the sensation of being watched. I turned to Timmy, who was standing in the doorway, his eyes wide and filled with something darker than fear, something like resignation. "Mom, it's not the closet," he whispered, his voice barely audible, as though speaking any louder would make the thing in the room hear him. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. I glanced back at the closet, half expecting to see something, or someone, emerge from the shadows. But there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting. Something that was too silent, too still. Timmy tugged at my sleeve, his little fingers icy against my skin. "Mom, I don't want to be here anymore." I felt a knot tighten in my chest, and for the first time, I couldn't argue with him. Something was off, something more than just a bad dream, more than an overactive imagination. My instinct screamed that we weren't alone in this house, that whatever it was, it had been watching us from the moment we stepped inside. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to make it stop. That night, when darkness fell again, I thought about all the things I should have done differently. I should have left the house. I should have trusted Timmy, should have believed him the first time. But instead, I stayed. I stayed because I couldn't admit that something was wrong. I stayed because part of me didn't want to face the truth. And then, as the house grew still, as the sound of the world outside faded into the background, I heard it again. The faintest scrape of nails against wood. A sound so soft, so subtle, it could have been nothing more than the house settling. But deep down, I knew. It was coming from the closet. This time, I didn't move. I didn't dare look. I stayed perfectly still, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath shallow, because I knew what would happen if I looked. Timmy's warning echoed in my mind, don't look. If you look too long, it won't go away. And so I stayed in the darkness, eyes squeezed shut, hands clenched tight, praying that whatever it was would just leave. That whatever was hiding in that closet would simply disappear, because I was too afraid to face it. I waited, listened, and with every passing second, I felt the presence draw closer. The breath, sharp and slow, was louder now, closer. I felt its weight, pressing down on the air. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. But when I dared to open my eyes, the closet door was wide open. And nothing was there. Only the shadows. The shadows that never went away. The room felt colder now, far colder than it had been moments ago, as if the darkness itself had crept into every corner of the space and wrapped itself around me. The shadows from the closet seemed to stretch, twisting and growing as though they were alive, bending in unnatural shapes that made my skin crawl. I wanted to believe that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was imagining things. But the chill in the air, the tightness in my chest, the sense that something was watching me, it was all too real, too undeniable. I tried to tell myself that I had to be strong, that I had to keep it together for Timmy's sake. But as I stood there in the dark, I couldn't help but feel a creeping terror that gnawed at me from the inside out. Timmy was still in his bed, huddled beneath the covers, his eyes wide with fear. He hadn't made a sound, hadn't moved a muscle since I opened my eyes and saw the closet door wide open, but I could feel him there, his small presence like an anchor, pulling me back from the edge of something I didn't want to understand. Mom. Timmy's voice was barely a whisper, as though he feared speaking any louder might shatter the fragile silence that enveloped us. I didn't know how to respond. How could I reassure him when I was just as terrified as he was? How could I make him feel safe when I felt like I was being consumed by the same fear, the same dread? I turned away from the closet, as if that could somehow stop the things I was feeling from spilling over, but I couldn't escape it. The pressure, the weight of something unseen, pressing in on me from all sides, suffocating me, making it hard to breathe. My pulse quickened, and my hands began to shake. I could hear Timmy's breathing, soft and shallow, and for a moment, it sounded as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Waiting for the moment when everything would snap, when the silence would be broken. And then, it came. The sound, soft at first, like the faintest rustle of fabric brushing against fabric, filled the room. I froze, my body rigid, every muscle tense, as though I had suddenly been paralyzed. The noise grew louder, clearer, until it became unmistakable, a slow, deliberate shuffle, as if something, or someone, was moving through the shadows. I turned my head toward the closet again, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something there, something dark and formless, just at the edge of my vision. Mom, please, Timmy whispered, his voice trembling with a fear that mirrored my own. It's back. It's in the closet. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what he saw, what I thought I had seen, because I knew that if I did, there would be no going back. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't pretend that the things happening in this room weren't real, that the fear was just a product of overactive imaginations. I had to face it. I had to know. I slowly, hesitantly, turned my head toward the closet. The door was still open, but there was something different about it now. The shadows inside seemed deeper, more pronounced, as if they were reaching out, pulling the darkness closer. And as I watched, the faintest movement caught my eye. Something shifted within the closet, just enough to make my breath catch in my throat. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was dry. My heart raced in my chest, hammering against my ribs as though it were trying to escape. I wanted to scream, to shout, to tell Timmy to run, but the words were stuck, lodged somewhere deep inside me. The only sound in the room was the slow, steady rhythm of our breathing, and the whisper of something moving in the dark. Timmy's voice broke the silence again, more frantic this time, almost desperate. "Mom! It's coming out! It's coming for us!" And then, I saw it. The figure, just barely visible in the gloom of the closet, emerging slowly, silently, from the depths of shadow. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its shape indistinct, like a black silhouette that blurred the line between what was real and what was not. For a second, it felt like the room itself had disappeared, like the entire world had narrowed to that one moment, that one breathless second, and all I could do was stare at it, unable to move, unable to look away. It didn't move like a person. It didn't make any sound, no footsteps, no breathing. It simply glided, its form stretching unnaturally tall, then shrunk back into the shadows, only to re-emerge closer, closer to us, until I could feel the air thickening, the very space around us constricting with its presence. My skin prickled with fear, my legs trembling beneath me, as I finally managed to force my body into motion. I grabbed Timmy, pulling him into my arms, but he was shaking too, his tiny frame trembling with the same terror that had a grip on me. I backed away from the closet, dragging Timmy behind me, my mind racing with the need to get away, to escape whatever was happening. But no matter how far I moved, no matter how much space I put between us and that closet, it didn't feel like enough. The room seemed smaller now, the walls pressing in, and the figure was still there, still watching us, waiting for something. "Don't look, don't look. Don't look," I repeated to myself, like a mantra, my voice shaky, as if I could somehow banish the thing in the closet by sheer force of will. But my eyes betrayed me. They darted back to the closet again, just for a moment, just long enough to catch the smallest glimpse of its twisted form emerging further from the shadows, inching closer. That's when I heard it. The sound I had feared. A whisper. Not from Timmy. Not from me. A whisper from the closet. It was close now, so close I could feel it, smell it, an acrid scent, like old decay mixed with something foul and bitter. The whisper was low, just audible enough for me to catch its words. "You looked." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, it was gone. The whispering stopped. The presence, the figure, everything. As though it had never been there at all. But the closet door remained open. The shadows never quite left. And Timmy's trembling hand in mine was the only thing that told me I wasn't imagining it all. Because I knew. I knew in that moment that whatever had been in the closet, whatever had been waiting, wasn't done with us yet. It had only just begun. The room was still, so still that the silence seemed to weigh on me, pressing down from all sides. It was almost as if the air itself had become heavier, thicker, as though it carried the presence of something that wasn't meant to be there. I held Timmy close, his tiny body trembling against mine, his breath shallow and quick. His fear was palpable, a tangible thing that seemed to bleed into the very walls of the room, leaving no space untouched by its chill. I wanted to tell him everything was going to be okay, to reassure him, to make him feel safe again, but the truth was I didn't feel safe, not anymore. I wasn't sure what was real anymore, and I certainly didn't know how to make any of it go away. I glanced over at the closet door again, but the shadow that had been there just moments before, the one that had moved with such deliberate, chilling purpose, was gone. The closet appeared empty now, nothing more than a dark space, the same as it had been before, save for the unnatural cold that lingered in the air. But I knew. I knew it wasn't really empty. There was something there. There was always something there. I had seen it, felt it, too many times now to believe otherwise. And I knew that whatever it was far from finished. Timmy pulled away slightly, his little face looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. His voice cracked as he spoke, barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "Mom, it's still there, isn't it?" he asked, his words trembling with fear, though there was an edge of something else, something desperate, beneath the terror in his voice. I didn't know how to answer him. I didn't know how to make him understand that what he was feeling, what he was sensing, was not just his imagination. That whatever we had encountered, whatever had been watching us from the closet, was not something that could be easily explained away. It was real. It was here. And no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise, I knew deep down that it wasn't going to just disappear. It never did. I turned my gaze back to the closet, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath coming in shallow bursts. The shadows there had grown, deepened, stretching and twisting, as though they were alive, morphing in ways that defied any logic I knew. I tried to tell myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on my mind, that it was just the way the light fell, but the knot in my stomach told me otherwise. Something was in there. Something was waiting. And it was closer than it had ever been. The silence stretched out, suffocating, until the low whisper broke through it once again. Only this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was a voice, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the very bones of the house, a voice that was both distant and too close at the same time, as if it was inside my head, rattling my thoughts. You should not have looked. The voice was dark, heavy, like it carried the weight of years, decades, even centuries, of something malevolent, something ancient. It was not a voice I could recognize, not one that belonged to any living being I had ever known. But it was there, in the very fabric of the room, wrapping itself around my thoughts, tightening its grip on my mind. I could feel it pressing in on me, pushing me further into the corner, into the darkness, making it impossible to escape. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen, as though it were no longer mine to command. Timmy's small, terrified gasp broke through the suffocating quiet, and I could feel his hands clutching at my shirt, his fingers digging into my skin, desperate for some reassurance, some sign that this nightmare was not real. But I had none to offer him. I had no answers. Only a growing dread that gnawed at the edges of my mind, telling me that things were about to get much worse. The closet door creaked, slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if something within was pushing against it, testing it, searching for a way out. The sound was so faint at first that I almost thought I imagined it, but then it came again, louder, more deliberate, like the slow, agonizing crawl of something that had all the time in the world to do as it pleased. The door, which had been slightly ajar, began to open wider, inch by inch, as if some unseen force were slowly peeling it back. My heart skipped a beat, and my breath caught in my throat. I could feel the air grow even colder, a biting chill that made my skin prickle, that made every hair on my body stand on end. And then, I saw it. The thing, whatever it was, had finally emerged from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form twisted and wrong, as if it were a distortion of something that had never been meant to exist. It was dark, so dark that it seemed to absorb the very light around it, the shadows crawling up its limbs like they were extensions of its own being. Its shape was fluid, shifting, as though it was constantly changing, constantly adapting. The edges of its body blurred in a way that made it difficult to focus on it, like trying to look directly at a moving shadow. But what was most terrifying was the way it moved. It didn't walk. It didn't crawl. It simply shifted through the air, floating, gliding toward us with an unnatural grace that felt wrong on every level. Timmy's grip tightened on my arm, and I could feel his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, his body trembling in my arms. I wanted to hold him, to protect him, but it felt like there was no safety left to offer. The creature, the thing in the closet, was here. It was real. And no matter how much I tried to deny it, there was no escaping it. "Mom, please." Timmy whimpered, his voice breaking, his eyes wide with terror. "What is it? What is it, Mom?" I couldn't answer him. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even think. My mind was a whirl of fear, a tornado of thoughts that collided and twisted around each other, but none of them made sense. The creature was close now, impossibly close, its form shifting, flowing like smoke, like something that didn't belong in this world. It reached out a hand, long, skeletal fingers stretching toward us, and for the first time, I felt the true weight of its presence. It was not just watching us. It was here. And it was hungry. In that moment, as I held Timmy in my arms and watched the thing draw nearer, I knew one thing with a clarity that cut through the fear: whatever this was, whatever it wanted, it wasn't going to stop. Not now, not ever. We had opened the door, and it had followed us. It had always been waiting. And now, it was our turn to face the darkness. The room was eerily silent, save for the faint sound of my breathing, slow and shallow, almost as if it were no longer mine. I could hear my heart pounding, but the sound seemed far too distant, too hollow. The darkness felt thick, like it was wrapping itself around my chest, constricting, squeezing, pressing down until my ribs felt like they were going to crack. The air in the room grew colder. It wasn't just the drop in temperature that chilled me, it was the heaviness of it. Like something was filling the space with a weight that pressed against every inch of my skin. It felt as if the walls themselves were closing in. I wanted to move, to do something, anything, but my body betrayed me, locked in place. I couldn't even bring myself to open my eyes, for fear that if I did, it would be too late. Then, there was a sound. Barely perceptible at first, but unmistakable once it registered, a soft rustle, like the faint scrape of fabric against the floor. And then another, and another, each one growing closer, drawing near. I could feel it, this thing, whatever it was, creeping towards me, just out of sight. I could hear its slow, deliberate movements, each one filled with purpose, as if it knew exactly what it was doing. The shadow, no, it wasn't a shadow anymore, not in the way I had seen before, was moving. Not from the corner of my eye, but right in front of me. I could feel its presence as if it were pressing against the very air around me. I heard a low sound, something between a breath and a sigh, just inches away from my face. My eyes remained shut, the darkness behind my eyelids deeper and more suffocating than anything I had ever known. I could hear the creature, its breathing, its rustling, each sound curling around my mind like a cold, damp hand. It was right there, so close, so impossibly close. I had no choice. I knew what I had to do. I squeezed my eyes shut tighter, as if that would somehow protect me, block it out, stop it from getting closer. But I couldn't stop the dread that was spreading, crawling through my veins, into my bones, taking over every thought. I thought back to the advice I had been given, don't look at it. Don't look, or it will stay. It would stay forever. But what if it was too late? What if, in not looking, I was sealing my fate, allowing it to slip further inside my mind, inside the very core of me? My pulse quickened, a sharp panic tearing at the edges of my control. It was now so close that I could feel its cold, clammy breath against my skin. My body tensed, every muscle crying out to react, but I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It was as if the very essence of fear had frozen me in place, locking me into this moment of torment. I could hear it, feel it, the slow, deliberate approach of whatever was stalking me, its presence a constant, suffocating weight in the room. I had no way out. No escape. Then, as if it had heard my thoughts, I felt something shift. A sudden gust of wind, too strong, too unnatural, rushed through the room, knocking the door open with a loud crash. The darkness seemed to fold in on itself, as if the very fabric of reality was twisting and warping. And just as suddenly as it had appeared, the presence was gone. The room felt empty. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I opened my eyes. The room was still. There was no shadow. No rustling. No cold, clammy air. But I knew, deep down, in the very marrow of my bones, that it hadn't left. Not really. It had simply retreated, biding its time, waiting for the right moment. And as I lay there, trembling, I realized that the worst part of it all wasn't that it had come for me. It was that I knew it would come again. Maybe next time, it wouldn't wait. Maybe next time, it would be far too close to escape.